Welcome back to A320 Knowledge, your trusted source for Airbus expertise. Today, we'll be diving into the approach and automation FMAs. The Flight Mode Annunciator, known as the FMA, sits at the top of the primary flight display, the PFD. It displays the status of the auto thrust and autopilot modes and is split into different sections. The FMA remains the main reference for the pilots regarding the status of the autoflight system and is a key part of Airbus's automation philosophy. Today, we're specifically focusing on columns 4 and 5, which deal with the aircraft approach capabilities and the automation engagement status. These two columns play a key role during approach and landing phases, providing vital information about the aircraft's automation levels. Column 4 provides crucial information about the aircraft's approach capabilities. This is especially relevant during both ILS approaches and non-precision approaches. When the aircraft is cleared for an ILS approach and the approach push button is pressed, the relevant column 4 indications will illuminate white. They are your confirmation of what level of automation and guidance the aircraft is prepared to offer. Let's go through each one. The first mode we'll discuss is Cat 1. This indicates that the aircraft is capable of conducting a Category 1 ILS approach, which typically requires a decision height of 200 feet above the ground. This indication typically appears if the approach push button has been pressed when above 5,000 feet above ground level. It will continue to cycle down to Cat 2, Cat 3 single, and Cat 3 dual as the aircraft continues to descend lower. It is also illuminated when the autopilot is disconnected for a manual landing during an ILS approach. If the approach push button is pressed above 8,200 feet above ground level, column 4 of the FMA will only display Cat 1, as this is the maximum range of the radio altimeter. Pressing the approach push button above this altitude is not recommended, as it can sometimes lead to an automatic disengagement of the autopilot at glide slope capture. In such cases, the flight directors will revert to either heading vertical speed or track FPA mode. The next mode is Cat 2. This indicates that the aircraft is capable of conducting a Category 2 ILS approach and allows the aircraft to descend as low as 100 feet above the runway before making a decision to land or go around. In most operations, any category lower than a Category 1 ILS approach normally requires an auto-land. Next is Cat 3 single, known as a Category 3A ILS approach. This approach allows the aircraft to descend as low as 50 feet above the runway before making a decision to land or go around. In this scenario, the aircraft operates in a fail-passive mode, meaning that a single failure does not cause any significant deviation in the aircraft's trajectory. However, the autopilot is disengaged and the pilot takes over control to land the aircraft, providing the visual references are sufficient. Next is Cat 3 dual, known as a Category 3B ILS approach. This approach allows the aircraft to land with decision heights as low as 0 feet, enabling automatic landings without requiring visual references. In this mode, the aircraft operates in a fail operational mode. This means that if a single failure occurs, even below the alert height, then the approach can continue as a fail passive approach and an automatic landing is possible. The third line of the approach capabilities FMA displays the relevant decision height or minimum descent altitude for the approach, as entered in the MCDU Performance Approach page. For Category 1 ILS approaches and all non-precision approaches, a minimum descent altitude from the approach chart is entered into the MCDU, and the FMA shows Barrow in white, along with the specified altitude in blue. Likewise, for Category 2 and 3 ILS approaches, a decision height from the approach chart is entered into the MCDU, and the radio FMA appears in white alongside the respective height in blue. However, for a Category 3B autoland without a decision height, No is entered in the radio section of the MCDU approach page, and the FMA will display no DH in white. Now let's dive into column 5, which focuses on autopilot, flight director, and auto thrust engagement statuses. This information is vital for understanding the aircraft's automation setup during various phases of flight. The first line of column 5 tells us which autopilot systems are engaged. If you see AP1 plus 2, it means that both Autopilot 1 and Autopilot 2 are engaged. This dual autopilot setup is typically used when performing an autoland, as it provides the necessary redundancy and accuracy for a fully automated landing. For AP1 plus 2 to engage, the localizer and glide slope, rollout, or go-around modes must be armed or engaged. Alternatively, you might see AP1 or AP2 displayed, which means that only one of the autopilots is engaged. Typically, CM1 will engage AP1 whilst they are pilot flying and vice versa. Now let's move to the second line of column 5, which shows the engagement status of the flight directors on each primary flight display. This status is displayed as XFDY, where X and Y represent the active FDs on PFD1 and PFD2, respectively. Here, you'll see either numbers or dashes. 1 means Flight Director 1 is engaged, 2 indicates Flight Director 2 is engaged, and a dash means no flight director is engaged on the corresponding PFD. For instance, if the display shows 1 FD2, it means Flight Director 1 is engaged on PFD1 and Flight Director 2 is engaged on PFD2. This is the standard FMA indication when both flight directors are active. Another possible indication is -FD2, meaning Flight Director 1 is off while Flight Director 2 remains engaged. In this case, pressing CM1's Flight Director push button should restore the normal 1FD2 FMA. If you see 2FD2, for instance, this indicates that Flight Director 1 is inoperative and Flight Director 2 is engaged on both PFDs, which may suggest a potential issue with Flight Director 1. The third line of column 5 is dedicated to the auto thrust engagement, which can be in either an active or armed mode, depending on specific conditions. When the auto thrust is active, it is displayed in white on the third line. The auto thrust becomes active when the thrust levers are positioned between the climb and idle detents while both engines are operating, as long as it has been previously armed. If one engine is inoperative, the auto thrust activates when the thrust lever is set between MCT and idle. Another way to activate the auto thrust is by pressing the auto thrust push button on the FCU while the thrust levers are within the active range. Additionally, the auto thrust automatically activates if the alpha floor protection is triggered, which is designed to provide maximum thrust in response to a high angle of attack scenario, helping the aircraft to recover. The auto thrust can also be armed under certain conditions. When it is armed, it is displayed in blue on the third line. On the ground, it arms automatically when the thrust levers are set to either the flex or toga detents, provided the engines are running. In flight, the auto thrust can be armed by pressing the auto thrust push button on the FCU when the thrust levers are positioned outside the active range. The auto thrust will also remain armed if temporarily inactive when both thrust levers are set beyond the climb detent or in single engine operations at the MCT position. Finally, the auto thrust automatically arms when the go-around mode is engaged by selecting toga in flaps 1 configuration or greater. Thanks for tuning into this tutorial on the approach and automation FMAs.